Hello everyone, and welcome back aboard the night train for the first proper video on the module I'm building for the Peco Rail 200 model layout competition. With the competition in full swing now, I have to finalise my design within the space restrictions that Peco have imposed on these baseboards. It's not as straightforward as I was hoping, with a lot of ideas immediately knocked down based off of the dimensions I had to work with. So, here's how I went about designing, redesigning, and redesigning this layout to try and bring my vision into reality within the parameters I had to play with. It was not an easy ride.
Just to reiterate, the competition baseboard is 75cm long by 30cm wide, with a height restriction imposed by Peco of 14cm. We'll come back to that. I've chosen to enter the modular category, so my track has to be placed within a certain area. I set this up in any rail to work around, as everything hinged on the track position and where other modules would be connected. While thinking about other possible entries, I expected a lot of other entrants would try to create features of a railway, such as stations, goods yards, depots and the like. So I decided I would avoid doing something too obvious or prototypical to try and make my design stand out. There were two core elements I wanted to include: the incorporation of standard gauge, 00 gauge, and narrow gauge, 009 gauge, as well as an homage or nod to railway history and evolution. My first plan was the result of some recency bias, as after a visit to the Swanage Railway I pondered a plan similar to that of Norden Station, where the narrow gauge mining museum had a raised bank with narrow gauge tracks and an old bridge going over the standard gauge line. But even with Peco's tight first radius 009 curves, there was just not enough space to swing the narrow gauge line round to include the bridge as satisfactorily as I would have liked. Plus, the station setting seemed pretty vanilla, and I didn't have anywhere near as much railway history represented as I hoped for. I went back to the drawing board, thinking about famous historical monuments that could be given a railway twist. Thinking outside the box, I had the idea of a Mount Railmore layout, so to speak, heavily inspired by Mount Rushmore in the United States, but with famous chief mechanical engineers and railwaymen instead of presidents. While I loved this idea as something unique to stand out against the crowd, the height restriction cut it down. That, and I couldn't actually find correctly scaled busts of all the engineers I wanted to include, or not for a reasonable price at least. So I pondered some more, keen to include a railway history inspired scenic feature that was informative, thought-provoking, and stunning all at once. And it was beyond the scope of the railways that I found my inspiration. My final idea actually came out from other interests of mine, so excuse me for going off topic for a moment. The first piece of inspiration was from my favourite video game of all time, probably, Brutal Legend. This is a hack and slash, real-time strategy, racing, open world hybrid game from the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 generation, and it featured a fictional world completely devoted to heavy metal music and imagery. Metal album styled scenery and monuments littered the landscape, bringing vintage album covers to life in unique and engaging ways. That inspired me to do something similar, embedding railway history into the environment, as if the world lived and breathed it. My other primary source of inspiration came from my interest in paleontology and the natural world. I've got the stratigraphic record of geological time and formations engraved in my memory, and that's when I realised the parallels of the evolution of life with the evolution of the railway locomotive. Steam engines grew in size, efficiency and power, before a mass extinction event, which gave rise to a new lineage, diesels, which gave way to electric, and so on. There is a historical record of different engine types and designs that could be told in a similar way to the fossil record buried within the earth. Mashing these together, this birthed my piece de resistance of a railway history inspired scenic centrepiece, an eroding cliff containing different stratigraphic layers of railway history, with the bottommost layers showing exposed Era 1 engines, the layer above showing weathering fossils of Era 2, 3 and 4 engines, with the most recently lost and deceased classes buried in the topmost layer of rocks. This spoke a lot about the mark railways have left on not just the trajectory of human history, but also the stamp they have put into the landscape that will persist long after humanity is gone. Tunnels, cuttings, embankments, and railway-reliant industries have left marks all over the earth that will persist for eons, making the last 200 years critical to the story of mankind's time on this planet. This idea allows me to represent many different facets and stages of locomotive evolution, without needing the physical space or ability to run or fit multiple engines on lines on the baseboard. As long as I can stack these different eras up within the cliff without exceeding the height restriction, I should be able to pull this off. With my core idea sorted, I needed to finalise the track plan. There was space to fit another length of track in front of the core piece, meaning I could have a foreground siding which would help embed the running line into the scene and have it pass through the landscape rather than just in front of it. While the running line is on a track bed, I opted against having the front siding set at the same height. I planned to pin this directly to the baseboard surface to allow trains to run slightly above whatever was stabled in the siding, really drawing out the sense of motion. With regards to the aesthetic, I decided to make the siding disused, purely there to store decaying rolling stock from eras gone by, adding yet more historical significance and value. Behind the running line, I wanted to add a platform, one lost to time and long since abandoned. This would have an overgrown surface, blending back into the environment towards the main cliff face. Shrubbery, gravel, grass and other weeds would cover this, making it as much a part of the environment as everything else. Behind the platform, at the base of the cliff, I'll have a narrow gauge line weaving through, giving the option to showcase some of the smaller, nimbler lines from railway history. Having the smaller engines right by the cliff with exposed fossils of larger engines right above them will make for an impactful, dramatic contrast. To really hammer home how integral railways have been, I'll weave parts into the natural environment to really sell this. Using recycled spares, I've ambitious ideas to try, such as trees made from coupling rods and signal posts, and toadstools made from buffers. The cliff face will also feature a coal seam, a nod to the very mineral that got the railways off the ground in the first place. With my idea and layout nailed down, it was time to begin. Before doing anything else, I mapped out the track plan in practice to make sure everything fitted. I aligned the front piece of flexi-track for the siding and marked out where this would go. Using a pair of coaches, I then checked that the clearance was fine with the running line. For the narrow gauge track, this needed to be relative to the platform and cliff face. Using some locomotive bodies I'd already gathered to embed in the cliff, I roughly decided on the cliff's depth. Next, I marked out the width of the platform, overestimating this slightly to give a little bit of breathing space. Using the narrow gauge track, I then decided on a position within the available area. Before laying down the track, I decided to spray paint the rails and sleepers to remove the plasticky shine and glinting of the rails. I used a can of spray paint and then wiped the rail heads clean while it was still wet, giving them a good clean with an IPA rubbing alcohol afterwards. With the track painted, I then pinned this in place, drilling holes with a pin vise and using Peco track pins to hold them in position. To avoid impeding the connecting areas where Peco were going to join the modules up, I covered these in masking tape to ensure they remained clear. I again tested the clearances with coaches once the track was fixed. While thinking about the platform, I dug out an existing one from the loft that happens to be the ideal size. The astute, long-term viewers among you will recognise this as the platform from my old Farquhar Yard layout and series. Gluing this in position, I checked the clearance with some Bachmann Thomas Class 08 with wide coupling rods, and made sure the position gave enough clearance for the widest engines. I then left this to dry, held in place by weights. With the platform in position, I realised there was not enough space to slope the rear down naturally to the narrow gauge line before sweeping up into the cliff face on the layout. There was not enough room in practice for a second gauge of track, so I had to go back to the drawing board once again. My solution was to use a strip of dual gauge track for the front siding instead of my existing flexi track. That eliminated the need for a separate narrow gauge line and still allowed me to feature both gauges in some capacity. I ordered a strip of Tillig dual gauge flexi track which came in a pre-weathered state, so I pinned this in place of the Peco flexi track. I used double-sided tape to hold it in position initially while I drilled out the pinholes. With that sticking point resolved, all my track work was finally complete.
So that's a deep dive into my planning process, changes and ambitions for this layout module. I'm really aiming for something special and unique with this project, so I really hope it comes into fruition as I hope. I'm not sure on ambition, but that might be an Achilles heel. We'll have to see how things go as I progress with the modelling itself. There's no wiring or anything to worry about, so I can dive straight into planning and working on the scenic elements. First, I need to narrow down the classes of locomotives I want to embed and represent in that sort of stratigraphic cliff face. But in the meantime, I'll start on the layout from the front and work back, to give myself time to finalise and collect all of the engines that I want to incorporate. I can't rest on that for too long though, as I'm sure the end of September is going to come around very quickly, given how busy the summer months get. So I really need to just get my head down and get going. To see how this goes, check back in by subscribing to the channel and making sure you've got that notification bell rung, so you know exactly when the next part of this Rail 200 project video series goes live. So, I'd better get back to it. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next part of this series very soon. Take care.